So what is macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is basically the study of the performance of an economy. Economic performance को हम measure करते हैं. अगर हमें economic performance देखनी होती है किसी भी country की, तो हम macroeconomics तो मैक्रो इकोनॉमी एक स्टडी है, एक ऐसी ब्रांच है इकोनॉमिक्स की जो आपकी इकोनॉमी की परफॉर्मेंस को इंडिकेट करती है कि हाउ वेल द इकोनॉमी इज गोइंग, हाउ बैड द इकोनॉमी इज गोइंग. तो अगर मुझे किसी भी इकोनॉमी की परफॉर्मेंस को जज करना हो, सो व्हाट एम आई गोना डू? आई ऑब्वियसली हैव टू लुक ऑन सर्टेन इंडिकेटर्स. कुछ ऐसे इंडिकेटर्स होंगे जो मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक इंडिकेटर्स होंगे. आई एम नॉट टॉकिंग अबाउट मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक ऑब्जेक्टिव्स, बिकॉज मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक ऑब्जेक्टिव्स आर फॉर्म्ड फ्रॉम द मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक इंडिकेटर्स. So macroeconomic indicators जो होंगे, they will be the judgment criteria of what kind of how the economy is doing actually. So for example, and so let's first go through the core macroeconomic indicators because they will tell us how the economy is actually doing. So for instance, let's say our first indicator is unemployment, right? So unemployment is going to indicate how much of the labor is without jobs, right? How much of the labor is without jobs. So what should be our macroeconomic objective? Our macroeconomic objective should be that we should have low unemployment, or we can say high employment. But the ideal scenario would be that we should have full employment. Now, this is the ideal scenario, right? Full employment means that all the labor is fully occupied, it's fully employed. So this is an ideal scenario though. But then again, the macroeconomic objective is low unemployment, or you can say high employment. And that stems, and why does the government has set this kind of an objective? This is a macroeconomic objective, by the way, because it wants to achieve the macroeconomic indicator. It wants to achieve that indicator of because it wants to measure the performance. Therefore, unemployment is an indicator of measurement of performance. The higher the unemployment, the bad the economy is doing, right? And vice versa. Moving forward, the second indicator is inflation. We all know what inflation is. It is a rise in the general level of prices. Now, why do we call it a general price level? We call it general price level because not every सब चीजों की prices थोड़ी rise हो रही होती है. हम जो basket of goods लेते हैं, that is the जो हमारी, because some of the goods are actually falling as well. कुछ goods की prices fall हो रही हैं, कुछ goods की rise हो रही हैं. But generally, जो एक आम basket of goods होती हैं, like basic, like entertainment हो गई, आपकी tourism, housing, clothing, food, all those common basket of goods that an average consumer spends on, unki prices on an average level rise ho rahi hai. Some may be falling as well, but on an average they are rising overall, right? So inflation is an indicator. It is a big indicator of growth and prices. It tells us about the prices in the economy. It tells us about the growth in the economy as well, right? So that, and because this is an important indicator, that is why the government sets a target of low and stable inflation. So the government's aim for mild inflation, that is between 2 to 3%, right? And to be honest, the government does not usually prefer deflation because deflation is also a sign of recession. Deflation is recessionary as well. क्यों है recessionary? You all know, because recession जो होता है आता है जब आपकी aggregate demand गिर रही होती है, तो AD गिरने की वजह से भी तो deflation आती है. Remember that जब आपकी aggregate demand is continuously falling. Remember, when AD is continuously falling, it is a sign of a recession. Okay? So the government also does not prefer deflation because that at times is a sign of recession as well. That is why the target is low and stable inflation. Third indicator for the measuring the performance of an economy is to go through the growth rates of the economy, to assess the GDP of the economy, to look at the economic growth in the country, right? Because economic growth and GDP is basically the indicator of incomes and living standards in the economy. The higher the GDP or the higher the economic growth, the higher the living standards and the incomes in the economy. So this indicator is very important. Because of this indicator, the government aims for economic growth that is strong, that is high economic growth. Strong economic growth को high economic growth भी कह सकते हैं. The higher the economic growth, the higher the living standards, right? Obviously. Not only that, the governments also aim for sustained economic growth. Sustained economic growth is that it is sustainable, that it is sustained in the long run. It is continuous. It continues rising till the long run. Right? In the long run as well, you have the same growth rates as you had in the past. So the aim or the objective is not only high economic growth, it's also sustained. That is also an objective. And not only it is sustained, but it is sustainable as well. Now, what do you mean by sustainable? It is somewhat similar to sustained, but then again, sustainable goes one step further because it means that the momentum or the rate of economic growth that you had should be continuous over time. This kind of means the same thing as before, but you need to understand that this can only happen when you will only have sustainable growth rates if the economy is doing well and it is the economy does not have excessive inflationary pressures. So the government wants a sustainable growth rate. A sustainable economic growth rate actually means that देखें अगर आपकी temporary growth आ रही, let's say Pakistan just goes through a temporary boost in GDP, and we know that that growth rate is not sustainable because we can foresee inflation as well. So an economic growth rate or a high economic growth rate that is quite temporary accompanied by huge inflationary pressures is not a sustainable growth rate. Remember that. So if you're having economic growth, but at the same time you're having significant inflationary pressures, that's not sustainable for you in the long run. So we want an economic growth rate that is sustainable in the long run, which means that it is without the significant inflationary pressures and that it is without excessive environmental damages as well, right? Because if the economy is growing at the expense, or if you're compromising environmental concerns, then that such a growth rate is not sustainable. कब तक आप environmental concerns को sacrifice करते रहेंगे? Ultimately, it has a huge impact on welfare. It has a huge impact on desirability. It has a huge impact on your domestic and local population, right? Because obviously we know how negative externalities can result into welfare losses, right? So that is connected to this point actually. So हम बात कर रहे थे about sustainability की, that sustainability is very important because if the growth is not, and this is a very good evaluation point that you can make as well. So for example, if you're writing a question on the benefits of growth, or you're writing a question on benefits of high GDP, or maybe indicating that the economy is doing well. So a good evaluation could be that if the economic growth or the rise in GDP is not sustainable, right, then what's the point, right? So there's no point in having short-term benefits when you know that there would be long-term sufferings. Such a growth is not sustainable for you. And this is a very good evaluation that you can mention in the exam, by the way, for your past papers. Okay? So that is why sustainability is such an important thing. ठीक है. दूसरा इंडिकेटर जो होता है मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स में, वो हमारे पास होता है ट्रेड. अच्छा, बाय द वे, ट्रेड is a component of balance of payment, and trade is a component of current account. That is exports over, basically we are trying to find out the balance of trade, that is how much we export and how much we import. What I'm saying is that अगर आप बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट का जायजा लें तो बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट में वी हैव करंट अकाउंट, कैपिटल एंड फाइनेंशियल, और उसमें से सबसे ज्यादा जो सिग्निफिकेंटली बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट चाहे पॉजिटिव होगा या नेगेटिव होगा, ये डिपेंड करता है, दैट इज योर करंट अकाउंट. एंड करंट अकाउंट ओवरऑल डिपेंडेंट है बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट, उस पे, ट्रेड पे, बी इट विजिबल एंड इनविजिबल, बिकॉज आपकी वॉल्यूम एंड योर वैल्यू ऑफ एक्सपोर्ट्स एंड इंपोर्ट्स आर प्राइमरीली डिटर्मिनिंग whether your current account will be in a deficit or surplus. And your value of the current account is primarily determining whether your overall balance of payment will be in a positive or a deficit or a surplus. So what I'm saying is that primarily government's का जो target indicator है ना, that is your trade deficit. Yeah, आपका जो trade है, यानी that is the volume of exports compared to the value of imports. That is the value of exports माइनस द वैल्यू ऑफ इंपोर्ट्स. ये जो ट्रेड है आपकी, ये आपकी किस डायरेक्शन में जा रही है? क्या ये डेफिसिट है या ये सरप्लस है? ना एक्सेसिव डेफिसिट अच्छा है ट्रेड में, ना एक्सेसिव सरप्लस अच्छा है. हम ये कह सकते हैं हाँ एक्सेसिव सरप्लस इतना बुरा नहीं है जितना डेफिसिट बुरा है, बट देन अगेन आवर टारगेट इज टू हैव अ बैलेंस्ड ट्रेड. हमारा जो ट्रेड होना चाहिए, दैट इज द वॉल्यूम ऑफ exports and imports, that should be balanced. There shouldn't be a huge difference between how much we are exporting and importing, because we know that it would create a disequilibrium. There would either be a surplus or a deficit, and we know the disadvantages of a current account surplus as well as a current account deficit. Why we know that? Because we have studied that in AS. That is why AS macro revision is crucial for you all. So आगे बात चलते हैं डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ इनकम. ये दूसरा इंडिकेटर है. अगर मुझे देखना है कि हाउ बैड और हाउ वेल एन इकोनॉमी इज डूइंग, व्हाट विल आई डू? आई विल लुक एट द डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ इनकम, कि उस इकोनॉमी में व्हाट काइंड ऑफ इनकम्स, हाउ आर इनकम्स डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड, whether they are evenly distributed or unfairly distributed, whether the distribution is equitable or unequitable. How bad is the gap between the rich and the poor? For example, in Pakistan, we see there's a significant gap between the rich and a significant gap between, isko kya bolte hain? What is the economic term that is used? Relative poverty. Relative poverty. What is relative poverty? Anyone? Relative poverty is an indicator of the distribution of income. This is a comparison of poverty between the rich and the poor, because the bigger the gap between the rich and the poor, the bigger the relative poverty, right? Because in Pakistan, we see that there are people who are extremely rich, and for them, everything is affordable. And then we see that there are people who are extremely poor, they can't even afford basic food, right? So this is an indicator of that the economy is not doing good. It's an indicator that the economy has not performed and lived up to its expectations of providing basic necessities to the poor. It is an indicator of bad education. It is an indicator of bad healthcare systems. Because why on earth is your economy in such a pathetic condition that people cannot even afford basic food? Why on earth is that? Why on earth why is it that the poor person cannot afford a basic one meal for himself? Why is that? Because it is indicating that he cannot get jobs because of no education. So again, we see that there are people who are extremely rich, who can afford all the universities and all the luxuries, and then there are people who can afford nothing at all. So this is an indicator of relative poverty, and it is an indicator that the distribution of income in society is unequal. And this is an indicator that your economy is not performing well. So again, if the distribution, and by the way, ये जो हम बात करते हैं ना कि ये distribution unequal है and all of that, so this is a normative judgment. There is not a fixed number कि मैं बोलूं कि अगर incomes का distribution इस scale पे होगी, then is equal होगी वरना unequal होगी. So it's a normative number, it's a normative judgment. Like it's a normative consideration and or opinion based thing, and it will differ from individual economy to individual economy. And so it tells us, we know the distribution of income tells us how incomes are distributed across households, right? And if distribution of income is unequal, then what should the government do? The government should start redistribution of the income, redistribute kare income. So what is one of the ways in which the government can redistribute incomes? So one way is progressive taxes, and secondly, increase the transfer payments, or you can say the welfare benefits in society. That is going to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. But this is just stating it. This is assessment objective 1 and 2 that you have satisfied. You haven't satisfied assessment objective 3, which is analysis, which means how would progressive taxes end up redistributing incomes? How would transfer payments end up redistributing incomes? And what is assessment objective 4? Evaluation. Even if government gives progressive taxes, even then incomes might not be redistributed well. Now you question me, how is that? How is it possible if the government is implementing progressive taxes and still the incomes are not redistributed? Because of inefficient tax systems. Inefficient tax systems honge, again the implementation is not correct, although the policies are correct, but their implementation is weak. Again, this policy will be a failure. Government की failure को क्या बोलते हैं economics में? Economic term क्या है उसका? Government failure. Remember, it's called government failure. Government failure is an economic term that signifies that why government policies fail. Again, maybe inefficient amount of progressive taxes were collected. Even if you are imposing progressive taxes, people find loopholes, tax evasion. Tax evasions take place, right? So if tax revenues are not collected, then does progressive tax systems guarantee that this is going to be effectively redistributed well in society? No. ये जो बातें चल रही हैं क्या? What is all this? What is all this taking place right now? What? It's a judgment. It's a conclusion. It's a judgment. It's an opinion. And that is part of evaluation. Assessment objective 4. We agree that yes, progressive taxes may redistribute incomes. But what about tax evasions? How are you foregoing that developing countries are poor, right? tax evasions and inefficient tax systems are highly prevalent in developing countries and poor countries. So how can you just make a statement that progressive taxes will instantly eliminate redistribution of incomes? मैंने क्या कहा था? Depth में जाना है. Moving forward, remember that apart from our core and main macroeconomic objectives, there are some other macroeconomic objectives as well. And these are secondary objectives. ऊपर वाले प्राइमरी थे, ये सेकेंडरी है. ठीक है, ये भी करने होंगे गवर्नमेंट को, बट अगर ये नहीं हो रहे इमीडिएटली तो उसका मतलब ये नहीं है कि गवर्नमेंट इकोनॉमी परफॉर्म अच्छा नहीं कर रही. फॉर एग्जांपल, अगर एनवायरमेंटल स्टेबिलिटी नहीं है इकोनॉमी में, राइट? So let's say according to the World Health Organization, let's say country A or the United Nations, country A is named as one of the worst countries to live in because there is a lot of environmental pollution over there. For example, a lot of environmental pollution exists in India and Pakistan. They have been named as countries. There's a lot of environmental pollution. But then again, yes, that's a problem. But then that is not as much as of a grave concern for economies right now. Again, evaluation. Another core objective, another objective is labor productivity. Economies want that, productivity of labor should be rising. They want that output per worker should be rising. What is labor productivity? We know what labor productivity means. It means output per worker, how much each worker is contributing or producing per hour or per unit. So governments must ensure that the labor productivity is rising. How they can ensure that? Education systems को बेहतर करें, ठीक है? Education systems बेहतर होंगे, labor productivity increase होगी. For example, if you go to KSBL is a Karachi School of Business and Leadership. अगर आप KSBL की वेबसाइट्स पे जाएं तो इनके बड़े स्पेशलाइज्ड प्रोग्राम्स फॉर मैनेजर्स, डायरेक्टर्स, people who are working in organizations, and they train them on different areas like strategy, leadership, finance, supply chain. All of these courses increase the productivity of labor. Again, this is one of the ways in which labor productivity will increase. Specialization is another way. Anyways, non-core objective, that is that the government should have sound finances. Sound finances means that the government should have enough funds to make its way forward in the economy, to repay its debts and to finance public spending. This is another non-core objective. But remember that अगर आपका economic growth अच्छी है, if you have good economic growth, low inflation, balanced trade, low unemployment, good distribution of income, you will have macroeconomic stability in the economy. So you want to talk about what macroeconomic stability means. It means that a country has good levels of growth, low levels of inflation, all together. If you're able to achieve them all together, all 4 or 5 of them, it means that your economy has macroeconomic stability. There's macroeconomic stability. So you can't say, oh, economy mein GDP grow kar rahi hai, to macroeconomic stability aa rahi hai. That's a wrong conclusion that you derive. You can't say that if there's low inflation, then you have macroeconomic stability. Macroeconomic stability is a huge term, right? So in order to achieve macroeconomic stability, you should have a mix of all these indicators being achieved. Only then there would be macroeconomic stability.